Warning spoilers. This video contains a detailed summary, so I recommend you watch the movie beforehand if you haven't already. Hi, I am Romy, a chair, and I will be your host today for this review on the Dead Poets Society. Anyway, let's get it over with. Introduction. Welton is renowned to be one of the most austere and rigid preparatory school in the country. Todd Anderson is a shy kid who has had a strict education. It is his first year at Welton. Mr. Keating is an English literature teacher whose methods of teaching and mindset contrast with the rest of the school. I will explain the rest of the characters as they go. Summary. 1959, start of the school year at Welton Preparatory School for Boys. The school's values are written on banners. The principal introduces Keating, a new teacher, who will replace the former literature teacher, who retired. The students meet, say goodbye to their parents, and move into their rooms. Todd Anderson meets Neil Perry, his roommate, who already has a group of friends and invites him to join. Keating's first lesson. The teacher leads his students to the trophy room, where he explains them the Carpe Diem. Seize the day, in English, is the reminder that one day we will all be dead. Therefore, it is our duty to enjoy the best we can every moment we have on Earth, because they are limited. This concept will follow us during the whole movie.
Because we are food for worms, lads. Because believe it or not, each and every one of us in this room is one day going to stop breathing, turn cold, and die.
He also asks them not to call him by Mr. Keating, but by "Oh Captain, My Captain," which is a reference to a poem by Walt Whitman. The poem is a tribute to Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated in 1856. But don't worry, I will come back to it later. End of the day, we see Todd Anderson writing, Seize the Day, on his paper, with a pile of boring books next to him. It's ironic because the teacher tells them to enjoy the moment the best they can, but they are stuck at school. The main character then rips his paper and gets back to studying as a sign of resignation. At this point in the movie, the hero doesn't take the Carpe Diem seriously and doesn't believe he can achieve this mental state. Keating's second lesson. He makes the students read the schoolbook's technique on how to determine the greatness of a poem, which he rejects completely. In fact, he even asks them to rip out the entire page. Here, Keating is trying to teach them to think and act for themselves.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion.
I believe this lesson can be applied to any form of art and cinema in particular. Lunch. The group of friends have found a picture of their teacher in a school book, with Dead Poets Society written underneath. After some investigation, Keating reveals it was a group of students who held reunions in an old cave where they recited and wrote poetry. It was their way to follow the Carpe Diem. After some discussions, the group chooses to go and find the cave at nightfall and reform the Dead Poets Society. However, while it is easier for some to disobey and run away, others, like Todd Anderson, are still scared and hard to convince. Evening. Neil Perry finds a book on his table, with notes and indications from Keating on the Dead Poets Society meetings. They proceed to escape the school and find the cave. This moment is very important because it is the first time in the movie where Keating's students break the rules from their own initiative. At break. Even though it is strictly forbidden, some members of the group manage to create a working radio and listen to rock and roll music. In the meantime, Neil Perry discovers there is an audition for a part in a Shakespeare play and desperately wants to play in it. Sadly, his father firmly forbids him to act, but he chooses to disobey him anyway and not tell him. However, Todd Anderson strongly disagrees with his friend's choice. At this point in the movie, the group of friends is divided in terms of mindsets between those who were convinced by Keating's lessons and seek for freedom and happiness without minding about others' opinion, and the scared ones who think Keating's beliefs are idealistic or too dangerous to follow. Afternoon. Neil Perry comes back to school exhilarated because he got the part and makes a fake letter to the principal to go play it. Keating's third lesson. The students read poems they prepared in advance. It is particularly hard for Todd Anderson, who is intimidated to read. So much that he didn't even bring a poem because he hated everything he wrote. Therefore, Keating asks him to come on stage and improvise a poem. During this interpretation, Keating shuts Todd's eyes with his hands and asks him to yell, to separate him from the rest of class. By doing so, Keating teaches Todd how to ignore the judgment of others, and most of all, to trust himself. Dead Poets Society's second meeting. Knox T. Overstreet met a beautiful girl named Chris at the start of the movie, and he is in love with her. However, she loves a football player, which he thinks is outrageous because she deserves better. He then decides to call her at her house and miraculously gets invited to her next party. Here, Knox learned the same lesson Todd did previously. He now listens to his instinct without minding about what others will say. Keating's fourth lesson. Keating and his class are in the courtyard, and he teaches them a lesson on conformity.
And we all have a great need for acceptance. But you must trust that your beliefs are unique, your own, even though others may think them odd or unpopular, even though the herd may go, "That's bad."
He then asks them to all walk in a different way, under the principal's inquisitive eye. Here again we can see there is a mental battle going on between Keating, fighting for the differences and open-mindedness, which for him are the key to a well-lived life, and the principal, on the other hand, who fights for conformity, which for him leads to a more safe life. Dead Poets Society's third meeting. This reunion differs from the previous ones because this time, Charlie Dalton, who now calls himself Nuwanda, brings girls to the meeting. He also announces he wrote an article in the school's paper to ask for girls to be allowed at Welton, signed by the Dead Poets Society. The other members reprimand this action because they are scared it will create trouble. At the same time, Knox T. Overstreet just arrived at the party. He rapidly gets drunk and kisses Chris, while she was sleeping, just under her boyfriend's eye, which, of course, he gets beat up for. School meeting. All the students are gathered in the meeting room. The principal walks in and explains that some students published an outrageous article in the school's newspaper. After that, he asks the students to denunciate the authors of the article. But, at everyone's surprise, Charlie Dalton denounces himself. He then gets taken to the principal's office, where he gets spanked repeatedly. But when his friends nervously ask him if he denounced them or not, he simply answers, "The name is Nuwanda," meaning he kept his mouth shut. Here we can see once again the metaphor of war, where Dalton would act as a true resistant against the principal, trying to get the names of his friends by any means possible, including torture. Interview between the principal and Keating. The principal, who has seen Keating's lesson on conformity in the courtyard and knows Charlie Dalton is in his class, tells him to stick to more academic methods. Keating replies that for him, education is here to learn and to think for yourself, to what the principal answers,
"Tradition, John. Discipline. Prepare them for college and the rest will take care of itself."
The two main points of view on education that since now had been fighting indirectly are now being put face to face. Sadly, the principal has the upper hand in this situation because he has the power to fire Keating. Evening. Neil Perry's father has heard about his son wanting to become an actor and goes to confront him. Neil tries to tell him he desperately wants to play, but his father doesn't care to listen. At this point, the fight for liberty and happiness seems to have failed. Then follows a beautiful scene where Neil explains his problem and his passion for acting to Keating. In answer, his teacher asks him to simply tell his dad the same thing. Even though it sounds impossible to do, Neil will have to face his father. Maybe it's the acting, maybe it's the stakes that are so easy to identify with, maybe it's the music, maybe it's the combination of it all. But this scene is overwhelming. Knox, the stalker, Overstreet, goes to Chris's high school to apologize for the party. She doesn't want to see him, but he forces anyway. He even goes into her classroom to recite a poem he wrote for her. However, the scene cuts here and we don't know what she thought of it. The suspense is at its highest. Neil Perry explains to Keating he has tried talking to his father. I couldn't think of a shorter name for the scene, but his dad still didn't listen. However, Neil learned his father will be gone on a trip the day of the representation. Therefore, he chooses to go and play the part anyway. Night of the representation. Chris showed up to Welton to tell Knox he embarrassed her in front of her school and that her boyfriend wants to kill him. However, he somehow manages to convince her to go out with him at the play. He swears that if she doesn't like him after tonight, he'll leave her forever, and she accepts. Can somebody explain to me, why are stalkers always rewarded in movies? The play starts, and Neil plays his role brilliantly. However, midway through the representation, his father shows up at the back of the room with a severe face. In the meantime, Knox's date is going great, and he even gets to grab Chris's hand. At the end of the play, when everyone is congratulating Neil for his wonderful acting, his father, who still hasn't said a word, comes in and takes his son away. His friends desperately try to convince his dad to let him go, but as always, he won't listen. At Neil's house, his father violently lectures him and announces he will send him to a military school. In this scene, we understand that Neil's father projects his own ambitions onto his son without even listening to his desires. At some point, Neil abandons to fight because he knows his dad will never understand him. At night, disappointed by the hard reality of life and hopeless, Neil decides to kill himself with his father's gun. This gesture can symbolize the director's opinion on how strict education affects children, but it can also be seen as the dangers of idealization. For example, here, Neil chose to believe he could live a happy and fulfilled life as an actor, but when he was faced with his father's hard decision and realized he would never live this dream life, he chose to kill himself. However, judging by the way the film is written and directed, it is more probable the authors blame the strict education and not Keating's lessons for the death of Neil Perry. Before dying, Neil puts on his head the crown of thorns he was wearing at the play. This is a reference to Jesus' crucifixion. In the Bible, Roman soldiers put a similar crown on the Christ's head as a sign of mockery. By putting the crown on his head, Neil places himself as a victim of our cruel society. The next morning, his friends are devastated by the news, and more especially Todd Anderson, who became his closest friend. This bloody tragedy contrasts with the beautiful snowy shots that follow, just like The Milk contrasts with hyper-violence in Clockwork Orange by S. Kubrick. This is because white usually represents peace in art in Western society, and contrasts, both visually and metaphorically, with blood and violence. The same day, the school conducts an investigation and interrogates the group of kids. Sadly, Richard Cameron, one of the Dead Poets Society member, signs a paper agreeing to the fact that Keating was the reason Neil Perry committed suicide. The other members reprimand his decision, but have no other choice than signing the paper. At this moment, the group of kids is at their lowest yet. The death of their friend, the dismissal of their teacher who represented hope and freedom, everything seems to go against them. The final scene is a class with a new teacher. The students start by reading the page Keating asked to rip off, when suddenly the latter comes in to get his personals back. When he goes to leave, Todd Anderson stands up and yells he's sorry to Keating. This intervention stops the class, and he gets asked to sit back down. But he does the opposite, gets up on his desk and yells to Keating, "Captain, my captain." Rapidly, other students start getting on their desks until the entire class is standing up, looking back at the professor they will forever miss. Keating proudly looks back at them and simply says,
"Thank you, boys. Thank you."
Finally, the students have conquered their need for conformity. They have learned to think and act for themselves, Finally, they are free, free to speak, free to act, free to be happy, free to seize the day. Conclusion. Now that the summary is done, I would like to come back to the phrase, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," Keating loved so much. As I said before, it comes from a response to Abraham Lincoln's assassination by Walt Whitman. At first, I didn't think much of this detail that I thought was unimportant until I actually read and understood it. In the poem, Whitman describes himself as a sailor, coming back home with his crew and the treasure they had been searching for. However, we learn the poem is addressed to his late captain, lying on the deck, who died searching for the treasure. Obviously, the captain represents Lincoln, who died for his beliefs, fighting against slavery in the U.S. In the film, Keating is the captain, who fought for his students' freedom until he was fired from the school. Todd Anderson represents the narrator, thankful for his captain's sacrifice. In both cases, the captain's legacy had an everlasting impact on the people around them, who acquired their freedom in exchange for their hero's life. In my opinion, all these details sprinkled throughout the film are what make it so unique. On top of that, I think Peter Weir mastered every other aspect of this film. For example, the values and problematics treated like injustice, happiness, friendship, or loyalty are perfect because everyone can relate to them in a way or another, just like the characters who are imperfect and human, which makes them moving. For example, if it wasn't for characters like Richard Cameron, who betrayed Keating, or the parents, who are the symbols of unfair education, the film wouldn't be as powerful. This combination of well-put-together elements are what make the heroes and the viewer go through a true roller coaster of emotions. Firstly, Keating's education creates a feeling of hope within the viewers and the heroes, who picture the possibility of an happy and fulfilled life. They then fall at their lowest when their friend commits suicide, and finally end on an hopeful note in the final scene, where the students show Keating his teachings weren't for nothing. About the cinematography, I think the grain of film adds an amazing character to the image and renders splendid shots. Finally, more than entertaining the viewer, this film prompts reflection and pushes us to see the world differently than usual. It reminds us our life is worth living, particularly because one day it will end.